So, victory for the RAF during the Battle of Britain was inevitable. That's the proposition that I'm putting forward, and it's probably slightly contrary to the general consensus and the view that most people actually hold. We like the idea of a plucky Britain fighting alone against a far superior foe, and then out of nowhere, through sheer sort of force of will, we're able to sort of pluck victory from the jaws of defeat. My opinion really is that the odds weren't stacked against the RAF. The odds were actually stacked massively against the Luftwaffe, and in fact they were so heavily stacked that there isn't really a realistic way that the Luftwaffe could have ever won the Battle of Britain. So as part of writing my book, there are details in the description if you're interested in getting a copy. Part of writing this, I researched into a number of different topics which are sort of outside the scope. One of which was, of course, a lot of the details of the Battle of Britain. Of course, we're viewing this from hindsight, and what I don't want to do is diminish the losses, the sacrifices that the pilots and other operators made during the Battle of Britain, but just really highlight that Britain was in a much stronger position than we perhaps otherwise like to think. We didn't know this at the time. So during the battle, we had overestimated, when I say we mean the RAF, had overestimated the Luftwaffe's strength. And likewise, the Luftwaffe had underestimated the RAF strength. And in fact, Hermann Göring initially said, I can do it in 4 days. I can defeat the entire Royal Air Force in just 4 days. Obviously, that was complete nonsense. But I even think taking the 4 months which the Battle of Britain inevitably lasted, from July until October 1940, even that was impossible for the Germans to win. So the battle itself was a battle of attrition. And basically what that means is that you have two sides fighting against one another, and they're slowly grinding each other down until eventually the numbers have been reduced on one side until that they can no longer really resist. And so that was the German aim. The German aim was not, they weren't going to completely destroy every single aircraft within the RAF, but they would have reduced us to a number probably around 150, 200 fighters, so that we couldn't actually defend the area over the southeast of England or London. We couldn't defend effectively, and they could basically bomb our cities, our airfields, our factories with impunity. Very much similar to how the Allies were during the later stages of the Second World War, when the Luftwaffe was so diminished that basically they had no chance of stopping our Lancaster bombers or the B-17s, the B-24s going over. They could offer very, very minimal resistance to that. So that was the German aim. They needed to reduce us to about 150, 200 enemy fighters. Now, we started the Battle of Britain with a mixture of Spitfires and Hurricanes, and there was something like 725. So you think, well, if they've got to reduce us to, say, 200, 725, then they've got to destroy about 500 or so fighters to be able to actually get that victory and to be able to get that air superiority over Britain. The reality is that actually what we were doing at the time is we were massively producing aircraft. So although we only started the battle with 725, we were actually producing 450 Spitfires and Hurricanes each month, well over 100 aircraft each month. So for the Germans to reduce us to that 200 figure, they would have to destroy every single new aircraft we were building, plus about another 150 a month. So they needed to destroy about 600 aircraft a month, each month, for 4 months to be able to get to their target. So this was actually, it was a massive effort. It was Lord Beaverbrook who had pushed the British war effort into say just massively producing huge numbers of aircraft. And in fact, it was double the rate at which Germany was producing aircraft. they were producing roughly around 220 Bf-109. They only had one single-seater fighter at the time, the Bf-109 or Messerschmitt. So they were basically producing slightly less than half of the number of aircraft than we were producing. We were also training around 200 new pilots a month. The Germans, on the contrary, were only training about 110 a month. So we were almost double the number of pilots we were adding in as well. Now, they needed to destroy 600 aircraft a month, but actually the reality was that they only ever destroyed about 350 on average a month. Still a large number, but it's only just over half of what they actually needed to achieve. And actually the situation for the Germans was worse than that, because we had something called the Civilian Repair Organisation, which could take these wrecks and crashed RAF fighters, and actually, although they were officially destroyed, we could repair them and put them actually back into flying service. So actually about 35%, a little over a third of all the destroyed RAF fighters would end up being put back into service. So the reality was that the RAF were producing fighters at a faster rate than the Germans could destroy them. So in a battle of attrition, this is actually the opposite of what you want. You want to destroy your enemy faster than they can replace their losses. But the Germans were actually managing the opposite. And so by the end of the Battle of Britain, the RAF had more fighters, Spitfires and Hurricanes, than it started it with. We also need to take into account that for the Germans to win the Battle of Britain, they needed to finish the battle having not only destroyed all of the fighter command's ability to resist against them, but they would also need to have still quite a formidable fighter wing themselves, roughly around 800 Bf-109s that they could use to maintain that air superiority over Britain. Because you imagine, if they've already knocked us down to 200, they've got their air superiority, they need to keep it for the foreseeable future while their bombers come over. So they needed about 800 Bf-109s to do that. So we can actually work out that based on their production rate and how many aircraft that they started with, they were actually not to maintain that 800 figure. They couldn't lose more than 250 aircraft a month. So they needed to destroy 600 aircraft a month, but they couldn't lose themselves more than 250 a month. So basically what they needed to do is they needed to have a kill ratio, which is how many aircraft that they could destroy for each one that they lost, of about 2.5. So for every one Bf-109 that they lost themselves, they needed to destroy 2.5 Hurricanes and fighters. Now, during the peak of the Battle of Britain, they actually managed to get to about 1.8. So the Germans managed to shoot down 1.8 Hurricanes and Spitfires for every one Bf-109 that they lost. However, that was a bit of an anomaly, and it didn't actually reflect the reality. Of course, the Spitfires and Hurricanes weren't just going up against Bf-109s, they were also being shot down by German bombers, which they themselves were shooting down. And so to keep some sort of round numbers, the RAF had about 1,000 fighters shot down during the Battle of Britain. The Germans lost about 1,000 bombers during the Battle of Britain, plus 900 fighters. So it's actually closer, although the Germans needed 2.5 British fighters shot down for each one of theirs, it was actually closer to 2 German aircraft shot down for each one British loss. And the loss of German fighters against RAF fighters, remember they needed that 2.5 to 1, it was actually more on parity, 1 to 1, that they needed. So they weren't actually close at all to getting to that sort of rate of attrition where they could keep their numbers high enough and our numbers low enough so that we couldn't replace them. But it was the human cost during the Battle of Britain that was particularly catastrophic for the Germans. So if a Luftwaffe pilot was shot down, or a Luftwaffe aircraft was shot down, their pilots were either killed, or if they managed to survive, they were captured. They were out of the war. And some of the German aircraft, such as the bombers, they had 3 pilots. We would have the Stuka dive bombers. They had a pilot, a navigator, rear gunner. And then you also had the heavy fighters, the Bf 111s, which had, say, 2 or 3 crew. So for each aircraft you were shooting down, it wasn't just always one pilot or aircrew that was being lost. It could be multiple. So there are stories of when the RAF pilots would get shot down, they'd parachute down, and they'd actually make it back to base, have a cup of tea, and then they were back up having missions, flying missions later that same day. So it was a horrific loss that the British suffered. We lost 544 pilots during the Battle of Britain. The Germans, on the other hand, lost 2,500 pilots and aircrew. I mean, it's just a horrific number. So, just in summary, to win the Battle of Britain, the Germans needed a kill ratio of 2.5 to 1. They needed to achieve that every single day for 4 months to get to the sort of what they could class as a victory. In reality, they suffered, it was switched, they suffered 2 losses for every 1 British aircraft that was shot down, and in manpower, they lost 5 times more pilots and aircrew than the RAF did. Completely unsustainable. So the Germans needed about 800 aircraft, as I mentioned, to be able to maintain that air superiority after the battle had finished, if everything had gone according to plan. But actually, despite all of their manufacturing efforts, they actually ended the Battle of Britain with only about 650 serviceable Bf 109s. And they started the battle with around 1,200 Bf 109 pilots, most of whom had about 2 years experience, because you have to remember that they'd fought in the Spanish Civil War, there'd been the battle for Poland, the Battle of France. They had tremendous experience, whereas a lot of the Spitfire pilots in particular, they'd have been kept back. They weren't involved in the Battle of France, so they were actually completely, in many cases, fresh pilots, having never experienced combat before. So over the 16-week battle, to that 1,200 number, about 500 new Bf 109 pilots were trained. That meant that in total there were 1,700 Bf 109 pilots that were available to the Germans. However, they suffered operational losses during those 16 weeks of about 1,000 pilots. So that includes pilots that were killed, captured, missing in action, but it also includes some aircraft would not necessarily be lost, but the pilots may have had horrific injuries, may have been able to land the plane. So it includes those gravely wounded, and also those that suffered from mental fatigue, because the Germans were pushing really hard during the Battle of Britain, and they have actually really high rates of attrition from mental fatigue for pilots that just basically weren't able to cope anymore. So they actually had what you'd call operational losses of about 1,000 pilots. So they ended up with 650 Bf 109 aircraft and about 700 Bf 109 pilots, of which probably less than half were those original 1,200 experienced aircrew. So more than half of those Bf 109 pilots were actually the new pilots that had been trained during the battle and were relatively inexperienced, and certainly they weren't comparable to the irreplaceable experienced pilots that had gone into the start of the Battle of Britain. So the Germans ended the Battle of Britain with the core of their experienced pilots, their veteran force, gone. This is in complete contrast to the RAF, which actually now had 3,000 pilots with combat experience, and they were able to take this combat experience and train up the next generation of fighter pilots, and pass on that valuable experience which they'd learned during the Battle of Britain. I mean, during Hermann Göring's initial plan, as I mentioned, he initially thought it would just take 4 days. He thought that there was about 400 fighters left in the RAF. As I said, there was something like 725. So it was almost double what he thought there was. But he also, for some reason, thought that the Luftwaffe, because they were so experienced and so incredible, would actually achieve a kill-to-loss ratio of 10-1. That's what he was expecting. And as I said, the actual reality was something like, for every one RAF pilot shot down or aircraft shot down, there was 2 German aircraft that would be shot down. He then extended his timetable to 4 weeks, but to actually achieve his goals of achieving air superiority, he would have had to fly an impossible 2,500 sorties per day and have a sustained kill-to-loss ratio of 5-1, which, as we've discussed, it's just completely impossible to actually achieve that. So the reality is that the Luftwaffe were at their absolute peak when the Battle of Britain began, and they finished it far weaker than they began, and they never really recovered. They'd basically consumed their veteran pilots during the battle and achieved really no strategic gain from that. But given the advantages of British production, repair, radar, and the home field advantage, the Battle of Britain was actually from the outset a mathematical impossibility for the Germans to win. So the Battle of Britain really should be viewed, it's not really a story of David versus Goliath. The RAF didn't win by the skin of their teeth. It was a story of the RAF being completely underestimated by the Luftwaffe and then being completely thrashed. In July 1940, the Germans had the strongest and most experienced air force in the world. By October 1940, so less than four months later, the Britain now had the largest and most experienced air force in the world, and also probably the most technologically advanced air force in the world. So after the Battle of Britain, did Germany go home and lick their wounds? Did they learn from their mistakes? Did they vastly improve their aircraft manufacturing program and pilot training facilities so that they could come back at Britain and sort of hit them again for the second time and finish them for good? No, actually what they did is they took the few remaining veteran pilots that they had who were training their new recruits. They took them, put them into aircraft, sent them to the front line, and went and invaded the Soviet Union. And of course, similar to the Battle of Britain, where they had the most powerful force in the world to begin with, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union with the most powerful army in the world, some of the most experienced. And of course, the results were similar to the Battle of Britain, quite familiar.